Hello and welcome to Comic Book Herald's Creannotators. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. Today, I'm joined by Dan Schkade, creator of Lavendar Jack, artist on Will Eisner's The Spirit, and San Hannibal. Lavendar Jack is one of my favorite webtoons, following the exploits of costume adventurer Sir Mimley Bastrop, taking on the corrupt elements of wealth and power in the made-up early 20th century city of Gallery. The series infuses elements of superhero, detective, steampunk, a whole lot more. Season 3 will conclude with the final 11 episodes starting on September 19th, which, as we're recording this, is only 4 days away. So we're definitely going to want to talk about that a lot. Dan, thanks so much for joining. How is the prep going for getting Lavendar Jack ready for the return?
Well, like everything like this, it's going well enough, but not as well as you want.
Sure.
But also, it's that pressure and muscle ache that often leads to the best last minute changes.
Okay. So you've got 11 episodes to conclude the final acts here of Lavendar Jack season 3. Folks can read a whole chunk of it right now over on Webtoon, and of course there's 100 plus episodes making up all 3 seasons to date. But that was one of my questions: is it fully complete, or like is this a you finish it up as it releases sort of thing? It sounds more like the latter.
A lot of it is complete. The last couple episodes are very big budget, and so they've taken a little bit longer to draw and get together.
Sure.
Uh, Partially just because this is the biggest thing I've ever finished. The Spirit was 12 issues, but every 3 episodes of a webtoon, at least the way that I do Lavendar Jack, is about a comic book, and it's been over 100 episodes. So this is, by any metric, this is the longest thing I've ever done. And you just want to make sure you land it right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because with Webtoon, which I've over the last couple years have been sort of slowly like getting up to speed with, like, okay, like there's a ton of great stuff here. Like you can't be a fan of comics these days and not sort of keep tabs on what's going on there, and oftentimes it can feel overwhelming. But there's great variance in length, right? It's often totally up to the creator. Some of the stuff is like super short, quick hit stuff. Lavendar Jack is much longer, I think, and much fuller by comparison to a lot of the other stuff that at least I've experienced on there. So the book's been on hiatus since 2021. It's coming back. I guess for fans of the book, you mentioned kind of at the intermission, you had some health issues. You want to take a break. How are you doing? Are your hands okay? Are your arms okay? What's the health of of the artist here?
The health is pretty good now. It was a bit of a rough year heading up to this, and thankfully, Webtoon was very patient with me.
Yeah.
They for a company with this quick turnaround as Webtoon, and there is some discourse about that. There is a lot of grind to it. There's a lot that's expected of artists very quickly, and Lavendar Jack is a very high effort comic. It's plotted very densely, and it's drawn very densely. We don't reuse a lot of assets. Pretty much everything is, like, we don't use 3D models for the background. It's pretty much all by hand. That said, Webtoon, like once a series ends, it doesn't go away. They keep it in their library forever. And when it comes to ending something like this, I think, it's late once, but it's good forever if you nail it. And so it was very nice to see that they were on board with that and didn't want to, make me rush it when I was sick. They're an ambitious company, but they're not monsters.
Well, that's good. That is good. Yeah, I'm curious about that. So, like, for comics fans, like myself, who are familiar with obviously the big two and standard, print to comic shop models, we know about, there's editorial oversight, right? And there's publisher arms. Webtoon is sort of this, I think, for a lot of fans like myself, this amorphous sort of, corporate blob. And it's like, well, what is, like, because you, like on Lavendar Jack, like you work with an editor, right? But that's like your own team. That's not like a Webtoon assigned thing. So when you're talking about Webtoon, like, who are the overseers of Lavendar Jack and your production?
Well, my editor actually was assigned to me, so to speak, initially.
Okay.
Yeah, Bree Boswell is one of the senior editors at Webtoon, and was, I think, an associate editor when she started on Lavender Jack, a little bit into season one, taking
Yeah.
over from the original editor, Becca Caden. And so Bree's quite steep trajectory upward at Webtoon has sort of uh, happened alongside the life of Lavender Jack, which has been very cool to see. I feel like I got in on the ground floor of somebody with real sky's the limit potential. But as far as the rest of the team, Jen Manley Lee, who's been the colorist since the very beginning, she uh, I was living in Portland at the time, and Jen was connected to the Helioscope, the artist collective I was a part of. She was, sort of attached to us, and once I saw um, her work, which is incredibly sensitive and intelligent, like a great intelligence for how color informs story and characterization, while still being quite local, quite uh, uh, like the colors aren't fantastical. They're vibrant and sort of pastel versions of what the world would actually look like, which is a really hard line to split. Like it looks kind of like a Taika Waititi movie in
Mm.
the sense in that it strides the line between style and reality. So as
Yeah.
soon as I saw that, and as soon as I saw that she'd been doing her own webcomic Dicebox for 87 years, I was like, this is my first choice. Like, especially since this was my first webcomic since I was a teenager. Like, I wanted somebody who had that those bona fides, that grit. And I was so pleased when she said yes, and she's been with me for 113 or so episodes now.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. No, that's it. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad you called that out because the coloring on Lavender Jack is fantastic. I mean, obviously there's the actual costuming of characters, like Jack. But then even just the way that you have to sell tone and facial expression, because it's a conversation and investigation heavy book at
Mm-hmm.
times, so it's not necessarily, you said it's going to end big budget, which I think is not shocking and makes sense, but like the book isn't always that. It has those moments,
Mm-hmm.
but color has to sell a lot of that stuff too, and I think that
Yeah,
comes across nicely. Yeah. uh,
especially because it has some light elements, but also has a lot of noir elements, and it's
yeah.
hard to find a colorist who actually knows how to thread that needle.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really like the use of shadow. Really since the series inception. I always think of like Gene Colan and then like Mike Mignola as kind of the artists I think of that are the best at like shadow. Like obviously I think
Yeah.
Hellboy is something where it's like sometimes you can say more with what you're not showing.
Mm-hmm.
Lavender Jack's great at that. It's great at that. And I know
Thank
it's
you.
both you
I
and the colorist. Yeah.
I don't get Gene Colan very often. That's a huge compliment. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Love his stuff. And something I do try to do in Lavender Jack is the kind of unexpected, twisty, more fluid anatomy he would use in his fight scenes. Like
Yeah.
he really wasn't afraid to like have this combination of Jack Kirby and Bern Hogarth style motion and torque to his figures, and I try to remember to do that with Lavender Jack, because it can be good to do the straight Frank Miller sort of more prescriptive version of force, but sometimes you need that fluid, like more sensitive. Like it makes me think of how some football teams are asked to practice ballet. Like you need that fluidity to inform the more rough and tumble tackle stuff, and I try to do that as well, but not as well as Gene Colan.
Sure, sure. No, it's an interesting comparison because it is when I think of Lavender Jack, definitely. I mean, the superhero comps that first are going to come to mind for people are obviously going to be the Batman,
Mm-hmm.
because of the fact that you have this character who is incredibly wealthy and then a superhero on the side, trying to do the right thing and take out the corruption in the city. But I see a ton of Daredevil in this because of the noirish elements, because of I guess just sort of kind of the early days Daredevil, the more of the lighter, kind of pre Frank Miller era. But long-winded way of saying, when you're talking about the acrobatics of Jack and just the action sequences, I'm definitely the type of reader who I love Frank Miller Daredevil, absolutely, but the prescriptive action, I don't need it to make sense. Like, it's part of why I love Kirby, is like, I kind of don't care if the bodies twisting don't ultimately add up to like human anatomy.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's actually not super essential because comics as a medium, you can kind of get away with that, right? Things add up at the end, essentially.
Yes. Something feeling right, in my opinion, at least the way I draw, something feeling right is more important than it being right.
Hmm.
As anybody who critiques my knowledge of geography in the plotting will tell you. So yeah, no, I pretty early on in my career, I took a pretty serious look at what my strengths were, how like what I could and couldn't do as an artist at the time, and landed on the idea that I'm like I have my ceilings as an illustrator, but I think I'm extremely talented as a storyteller,
Hmm.
and using theater techniques and low budget film techniques as a way to condense the visual elements I had to draw to get across the kind of story I wanted to tell. Which is why, like early on in the comic, you see a lot more like traced buildings and slightly more like high effort crowd scenes,
Hmm.
but those just go by in a blink of an eye when you're scrolling on Webtoon. Like
Yeah.
you have to think about how the information is being conveyed differently, and it usually does come down to less is more.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's definitely interesting how the medium would shape that. So let's look again, kind of at. So we're wrapping things up here, or you're wrapping things up here with Lavendar. I'm definitely. If you can sneak me in a credit, I will accept it, but probably I don't deserve that. The final 11 issues are here. Why do you feel like now is the time to end it? Definitely, the world of Lavender Jack, I think, has found a big audience on Webtoon. It is the type of story that certainly could go for a good long time. That said, good stories often have good endings. Why now? Why now for you?
Well, there were a number of factors. It wasn't it wasn't entirely my call, um, and because Lavender Jack has in terms of raw number of people who read it and are fans of it, it's huge. It's bigger than anything else I've ever done. But in terms of Webtoon, it's definitely a small fish,
Mm,
and I think they're pivoting to focus on different kinds of stories. Lavender Jack was brought onto Webtoon during a period of some experimentation when they were making really like aggressive, proactive strides into the American style of doing comics. So long story short, it made sense to not try for another season at Webtoon.
okay.
Now, in terms of story, it does. This is a pretty reasonable place to leave it. We've built from a fairly intimate uh, like criminal conspiracy revenge story in season one to essentially a political terrorist story in season two, and then season three is about World War I, or its corresponding version of it in our world.
Right.
And with every step of it, we track the themes of uh, how do the ideas of noblesse oblige, of the wealthy having responsibility to take care of the less fortunate, how do how does the pressures the 20th century put on those ideals evolve as you widen the scope of like how big an area, how many people you're looking at. um, it, Madame Ferrier says it in an episode of season three that uh, in its own way, war is the largest criminal conspiracy the human race is capable of. So approaching war from the perspective of a detective story, of a you know a class based vigilante story, this makes a lot of sense as the final exam for those characters and those themes.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's definitely all everything that happened in season one coming full circle in terms of the antagonist, right, with Lady Hawthorne
Mm-hmm.
and the Hawthorns returning. I mean, yeah, no, it's a definitely feels like a successful um ending point, or it could be. I guess the thing for me is more when I say it feels like it could keep going, it's just because you've built such a fully enriched world with all these characters where, like, when you do, for example, the flashbacks, with Detective Ferrier or Ferrier in these the build up to this final conclusion. It's like, oh, like you could do those for a good chunk of time, right? If you wanted, So I feel like there's obviously, and I'm sure you thought about this. There's a lot of directions you could go. I guess let me ask it outright then. So like, you're doing this through Webtoon. Superhero type stories kind of like this definitely aren't the bread and butter of the platform at this point. When it ends, when it comes to a conclusion, kind of where do you stand in terms of being able to take Lavender Jack somewhere else, or even just stuff like getting the print run out there and things like that?
Well, it's a little complicated for various reasons, but I would love to find a home for more Lavender Jack stories after this, and probably after a bit of a break. I have a couple things that are coming together for 2023 that I'd like to focus on for a while.
Sure.
And Lavender Jack, I've been doing it for between 4 and 5 years, depending on when you start the counter of doing it, like
Mm-hmm.
if how much of pre-production you count. And I've evolved as a storyteller since then, and I've there are just things I would do differently, and I wouldn't mind having a year or so's break to sort of reevaluate those with fresh eyes, those elements. That said, you know, throughout the basically since season one, there's always been talk of doing a Teresa Ferrier series, and I've actually done a lot of work for that. Because she's in her mid 60s for most of the events of Lavender Jack, and just for my own, like, just because it's useful for timelines to lock some things down, I placed her birth date in 1850, since the beginning of writing her. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, if she's starting out as a detective in her early 20s, that gets us into the 1870s, which is a fascinating period in France. They had just lost the Austro-Hungarian War, and the whole country was like, a lot of it was badly damaged in the war. People got really conservative and scared and mean, and like what a great sort of Gotham City version of France to track these two detectives in. Madame Ferrier, who's like young and kind of raw, and her partner Captain Barada, who he's seen in flashbacks, and who, you know, like has just lost his arm and is dealing with that. Like, I would
Yeah.
love to do that series, but whenever whenever it looked like we might pivot to that. We ended up doing another season of Lavender Jack instead, and I don't think we'd be able to go right into it after Lavender Jack ends. Um, but very very long answer to your question. But there is a lot more to do in this world. I'd love to check in and see what's happening in the '60s in this universe. Elderly versions of the characters that make it. Um, I'd love to see like a space race in the '40s. Just I think there are ideas that would scale really well into stories that press on into the 20th century, and if we like track those one at a time, we could potentially build to see what the world of Gallery looks like right now. Who knows what that would be like? Maybe we worse. I don't know.
That's interesting. So yeah, talking about sort of that alternate history exploration of these characters actually catching up, or these generational sort of, who are their offspring, and who's still connected to them and all that. That makes me think of, I've seen you reference in interviews, and it's something that I actually caught up on somewhat recently. I'd read the first few issues as Matt Wagner's Grendel,
Oh yeah.
and how that series, it feels like it's one thing, and then as it continues, it's like, oh, it is a story across centuries, across space. Right now, it's gone to, it gets massive, right, and it's definitely something that I think is often very fun. You got to work with Matt Wagner on the Spirit, on
That's
Will
right.
Eisner's The Spirit. What were, as a fan, as a creator yourself, like what were definitely some of the biggest lessons you learned in that
Mm.
in that experience?
Matt was such an education, because I didn't go to art school. All of the abilities that I brought up to working on the Spirit were self taught, and Matt, storied professional. Like, he taught me how to use a light box. He taught me a bunch of time saving methods. like, and he taught me just little tools that you don't learn casually, like on every page, make sure in one panel there's a big head,
Hmm.
because if the head, like, it breaks up the size of the panel, and or of the it breaks up the variety of figures you see. It gives you one cut in to focus on what a character's saying, just like
Sure.
little things like that.
Huh.
And and a big thing that he impressed on me was how the communication is the most important thing, and if you're trying to get too stylish and finicky, but it's getting in the way, you're like making your life harder, and you're making the book worse. So to draw the way I do, which is pretty stylistically, and to have Matt, who's, was an inspiration to me as a kid, as somebody who draws that way, it was an extremely like Mr. Miyagi relationship. And he was hard on me too. Like he would have me redraw whole pages. Every week, I would bring my pages to his studio, his physical studio in Portland, and especially in those beginning issues, it was pretty tough stuff. But early on, he saw that I could take that I wasn't somebody who was very precious with my work. And anybody who has the misfortune of being around me all the time will tell you that there really is nobody who's more like relentlessly frank about my work than I am. But it's because I know how good it can be. I have great confidence in my abilities. I think that when it comes to what I do, by the time I hit 40, I think I'm going to be one of the best people working at doing the kind of comics I do. But if I want to get there, you know, Matt didn't mollycoddle me. I can't mollycoddle myself.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It is one of those interesting things with comic artists where your work progresses so steadily. I feel like a lot of times in the industry, with writers, it doesn't necessarily translate the same way. Like with writing and storytelling, like there's not a cutoff. Like there are plenty of writers who stay good for a good long time,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a certain, I don't know, like there's a certain churn in the industry where it's like people have their moments and it lasts for 5 to 7 years. But then it seems like with illustration, obviously Kirby being the king and all that, but it's like it's so easy to forget that, like, when he's coming on and inventing the Marvel universe in the 60s, he'd been doing it for 20 years. Like he'd been around forever at that point.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
like it's such
and
a skill that you'd have to get the hours in.
you know, uh, 1940s Kirby is different from 60s Kirby, is different from 80s Kirby. Like he evolved a lot. He always had the same, storytelling priorities, if you will. But you see that growth in him. You see that growth in artists like Neil Adams. Um, you just see a lot of writers progress as well, but their progress is a little bit harder to see. Um, in my opinion, writers tend to be a little more susceptible to falling into ruts.
Yeah.
And like a writer I really liked uh, coming up was Brian Azzarello, and who's done amazing work. His comic Batman Broken City is amazing. I really liked his Cage comic with Richard Corbin. Obviously, 100 Bullets is seminal, like early 2000s comics. Uh, but I think he fell into a lot of tropes. I think he got addicted to a certain rhythm of storytelling, and it wasn't a good enough rhythm to keep his work interesting to me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And I still think he's doing good work, but in terms of like I feel like he's an example of a writer that for Dan Schkade plateaued in a way that like Brian Michael Bendis, it has stayed fresh to me throughout his.
That's the name I was just thinking of, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, because Bendis definitely has a rhythm. He has a
Mm-hmm.
type of story that he tells. But if you look at the original Powers, and then you look at New Avengers, and then you look at Superman, those are different keys of the same instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this search for a kind of spectacle meets casual humanism that his work has sort of strived for throughout his career, it has continued to evolve, and that's what I'd like to shoot for. I'd like to sort of refine and expand my toolbox as I go, as opposed to just finding what works for me and sticking with that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense. That you don't want to just be like, well, here's my thing,
Yeah,
and
and
I've got it down
I'm
now.
quite young to decide that. I'm 32. Like this would be a weird time to plateau.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully not. So with Lavender Jack, like what you've had this good long run with it. Like you said, like if you're putting this in comic issue terms, I don't know what it would break down to, but it's a run. Like
Yeah.
it's a sizable thing. What characters have gone in the most surprising directions for you, like as a
Mhm.
storyteller? Like ones that you thought, maybe were going to be small, or you had a plan and then something else happened.
It's funny. Um, there are some characters, like there are very few characters that have just gone in completely different directions. Like I feel like I've, because they're hewn from such sort of clear archetypes. It's hard for them to go too off the reservation, but the way that they've thrived within those parameters has surprised me. Like very quickly into the comic, my favorite character became Honoria Crab,
Yeah.
who, at the beginning, she's supposed to be a foil for Madame Ferrier. She's supposed to be very stiff and by the rules, and she was supposed to go through a pretty conventional, like, rookie cop learns nuance arc. But the more I went, the more I realized this is a comic of very subtle, intelligent people who, like, have different types of intelligence, but everybody's pretty smart in the comic and speaks in this very Bertie Wooster, Agatha Christie kind of uh, gumbo of talking. Lots of polysyllables, lots of understatement, and so having somebody who is who's just like a just the facts man person who speaks very plainly, who is like allergic to like coyness
Yeah.
and cleverness. Like, what a useful character. And also, she doesn't know karate, but she's a brawler.
Yeah. Yeah.
She looks good getting beat up. I don't know. I just love her. I love her so much. I could write Honoria Crab forever. Um, and I was surprised how kind of humble and modest Sir Memley became. You know, uh, sort of the idea that if you really are cool, you don't need to tell people you're cool. And it's like if you're a rich, martial arts expert, athlete, genius engineer, you kind of lay in the cut. When it's time to do your job, you do it. And the rest of the time, you don't need to put people down. So little things like that is the big failure for me about the comic in terms of like a character who had a lot of potential that I just didn't capitalize on is Abby Coral, the editor and extraordinary of the
Hmm.
Gallery Glossary. Like
Interesting. Yeah.
she's introduced as like Memley's close friend who doesn't know he's Lavender Jack, which is a classic secret identity trope, which I love. Secret identities are awesome. People who don't think there should be secret identities in comics are have a different opinion than me. That's how I'll say that.
That's the nicest way to say it. Yeah.
And as the series went on, like her utility just kind of went away because she kind of comes down to being another investigative character in a comic full of them. The thing I so wish I had done, because it would have made all the sense in the world, is I wish I had made her his aunt instead of his friend.
Mm.
Because in the P.G. Wodehouse, Jeeves and Wooster stories, and Sir Mimley is most heavily drawn from Bertie Wooster.
This
He
this series introduced me to PJ Woodhouse. That was my first experience.
It's delightful. It's
Yeah.
really delightful material, and
Very
the
fun.
idea of like what if like yeah, Bruce Wayne and Britt Reed and Lamont Cranston and all these characters kind of pretend to be Bertie Wooster characters, but actually they're quite serious. I
Hmm.
thought, what if he wasn't pretending? What if he's actually like that? He's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
also a serious vigilante. Um, but so Bertie has two, sometimes three, kind of domineering aunts. One of whom is never pleased. The other whom is kind of his pal, but is like dangerously ditzy. And Mimley makes like reference to having an aunt who's passed away. But I would love if Abby was like his aunt through marriage, who would have known him longer, who could give more like insight into how he's changed, because there's really nobody who knows him before who knows him now, and we're very vague about um, like how long Abby and Mimley have been friends and like how their
Right.
relationship started.
Right.
The only person who really has known him that long is Dame Doctor Agatha Sampat, um, who he and their late friend, his late boyfriend Geo, like
Yeah.
they invented this great thing together. But then she's tied to his origin story, so she can't have the same kind of objectivity that Abby could have had if I just positioned her in the plot differently.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you say it, I'm just like, yep, like all, like everything about this would fit.
Right.
But hindsight on that one for sure. That's
Yeah.
funny. Yeah, but I mean, it's such a fully built out cast that certainly you have enough going on that I suspect most readers aren't like, oh man, like I really wish, I really wish they had gone with the family angle on
Yeah,
on the newspaper lady.
there there really isn't anybody I dislike, which is a nice thing to say.
Yeah,
It's
sure, no
it's nice to be
characters that you're
4
like, oh,
years
I gotta
in,
do
and
this. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. There's nobody who's a chore.
That's good. That's good. How much? So one of the unique things about releasing via Webtoon is you get like an instant comment section on your performance, right? Which I imagine is quite different than the standard comics approach, right? Where it's just word of mouth and social and reviews and stuff. How much attention do you pay to that, and how dangerous can that be?
Well, I remember up till now when I did the Spirit and when I drew that Battlestar Galactica miniseries and some other just short things I've done,
Yeah.
I became addicted to checking. I think it's called Comic Book Roundup, which is like
Yeah.
a review aggregator.
Yeah.
Um, but it all comes later, and a lot of times the reviews are fairly uh, broad. There's not a lot of in-depth reaction. And so when Lavender Jack debuted on Webtoon, I saw that very quickly there were 26 comments. I'm like, holy cow, that's so many. Like not knowing that every episode would get like 100 minimum as it went on. I didn't read the comments for the longest time. I didn't read the comments for like the first half of season one just because I was nervous. But then I started reading them, and as the series evolved, I became so pleased, so I guess grateful, even weirdly proud for the audience the comics built up.
Mm.
These are very intelligent, sensitive people, and some of them say very nice things. A comment was pointed out to me just today. I have somebody who's sort of uh, somebody kind of special to me who's now reading Lavender Jack for the first time and looking at the comments, and they pointed this comment out. In season three, Mimley says something about scars. I don't remember the exact line, but it's something like, uh, that scars are evidence of a life lived, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody in the comments talked about a scar a series of scars they just picked up over the course of their life, and how that gave them a different perspective on it. Like, I don't know. Nobody ever said that about the Spirit. Like, it
Yeah.
was such a
Right.
these people really connect with it.
There's a
And
community building aspect that I think you just can't get with the traditional comics release format.
that's true. It's really true. Because in the traditional comics release format, there isn't like a central place to comment.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about it on Reddit or on Twitter or on Facebook, but and those are three very different audiences, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
But with Webtoon, pretty much everybody's talking about it in the comments right under the episode, um, and the viewers the readership, like, overall very positive. And if somebody comes in with something gnarly to say, they police that guy. Like the other people in the comments, like
Yeah.
vote him down and like, hey, we don't talk that way here.
Yeah.
I'm barely ever in the comments at all because they just manage themselves so well.
Right.
And furthermore, there are eagle-eyed fans in the comics who have predicted twists, who have like solved bits of the mystery beforehand. And instead of like changing the mystery to stay ahead of them, I'm like, awesome. Like it's so gratifying to me that I put the pieces in place that allow you to predict that.
Yeah. Okay.
There's one case where the readers predicted a character that hadn't even shown up yet. I'm like, this is so cool. Like
That's
this
awesome.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, it is awesome, isn't it? Like this is the audience I like dreamed of finding this comic.
That's amazing. I'm perpetually fascinated by, because I'm on most websites or YouTube or whatever. I would never scroll down and like read the comments as like part of the experience. Like I don't need that. But on Webtoon, I always want to read the first three because they're so consistently positive. There's such a love for the story that folks are reading together. Like it's tremendously unique to me in my experience of what fandom often can be. Like it's like the purest, like I love this comic and I'm glad to be here with people that love it too. It's very nice.
It is very pure, and because it's sort of a younger version of fandom culture. Like
Yeah.
not everybody who reads the comic is a teenager, but the culture of consuming content is very like young and TikToky. Uh, they uh, uh, they like memify the comic in a really like cool way. Like the idea of people being really thirsty for an Oreo crab is like
Yeah,
that emerged pretty quickly. There was this like people would make memes of the Black Note, the season two villain. Like
yeah.
they on like on Twitter they would make image edits of like him about to blast somebody with his sound weapon. Instead of what he's saying, they put in like, anyway, here's Wonderwall. So they're just like,
Yeah,
they're funny, and like
yeah.
I'm a pretty, like I'm kind of a boomer. I'm easily charmed by stuff like that, but it's just so fun to see people engaging with it. And by the way, the fan art, amazing what some people have done. Not even, geez, I do sound 80, but it's really cool. Like people have
Thing
made,
these kids are doing out here with their
right.
fan art.
um, some people have done fan comics. Some people have done um, like dubstep, like I don't know, animatics
Oh, that's
for the
cool.
comic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, there's there's one person who did, I don't know, like I found Lavender Jack like like slashed with Bertie Wooster. I found a fanfic of that.
Okay, nice.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's just really, why do this if you don't want something you create to have a life of its own in other people's heads? And to see that happening with Lavender Jack has genuinely been the most gratifying experience of my career.
That's amazing. That's good. What are you happiest with as far as your own development as a creator and as a storyteller? Now that you're approaching the conclusion, right? We're here in the final moments. What's the stuff where you look back and you're like, I got so much better at blank.
I think and I still struggle with this sometimes, but I think I've gotten better at realizing that everything is a vehicle for character. That if the character isn't, if the characters, if their personalities, if their wants and their different strengths and weaknesses, if those aren't firmly established, then the plot it's basically just a word puzzle. Like you need that emotional content for everything to feel right. And even though I thought we did have a good version of that in season one. Um, a lot of that had to do with the fact that we were using pretty well established storytelling tropes. There were the detectives trying to solve essentially a serial killer case. If in terms of how the plot worked, uh, with Ferrier and Crab trying to find Lavender Jack, and then Nimley and Ducky on a revenge mission. Like it's over here it's Seven, and over here it's Death Wish. Like these are
Yeah.
so I was able to develop the characters inside of that. But then you get into season two and especially season three, these are pretty, in my opinion, pretty original types of story. And so like I've had to develop my ability to not get so lost in the plot that you forget to have the character moments that make the thing worthwhile.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So before Lavender Jack, you worked more in not more, but you worked very deliberately in noir,
Hmm.
with Sam Hannibal and the Spirit certainly. You mentioned kind of noirish elements certainly to Lavender Jack, which are there. What are some of your favorites of the genre? Like, what are some of your go tos for inspiration and things that you love there?
Oh wow. Well, I'm a big Philip Marlowe fan. I like the hard-boiled books, and they got turned into great noir movies. One of my favorites is Murder, My Sweet, um, which is a film adaptation of Farewell, My Lovely. It has Dick Powell as Philip Marlowe. It has this amazing opening scene where we enter a police interrogation room, and Marlowe has his eyes bandaged, and he's being grilled by these cops. And the whole movie is told, hits his testimony to the cops. Before he'll before he'll talk, he makes him put a cigarette in his mouth and light it, almost like he's up against a firing wall. That one's awesome. I love Double Indemnity. Um, and even if this isn't always thought of as part of the noir canon, but and it's also almost a boring answer, but I love Casablanca. Like
Yeah,
Casablanca, for
no, it
my money,
fits.
is like a perfect movie, and you
Yeah,
see there are a lot of like a lot of the my attempts to do romance scenes in Lavender Jack. A lot of those pull from some Casablanca visual cues.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of noir. Um, there have been great neo noir works. Like one of my favorite movies is The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola. In fact, we reference the end of The Conversation in season two, where Gene Hackman's uh, surveillance expert main character has become convinced that there's some kind of surveillance equipment in his apartment, and so the last scene is him searching the apartment and then like taking everything off his bookshelves and then tearing the bookshelves down, and by the end of it he's like ripping up floorboards. He's destroying his apartment trying to find this thing, and I was so taken by that a character does that in season two.
yeah.
Um, anyway, I'm a big movie guy, so I could go on about this for a while, but I think that I'm definitely an artist and a writer who takes a lot of cues from movies,
Sure.
and the fingerprints of those are all over Lavender Jack.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome. I got to do Double Indemnity and Casablanca for the first time earlier this year. I was
Oh,
catching up. I had like a string of interviews with Noorish comics creators, so I was like, I should really take the time to
what'd
do
you
some of
think?
these things. I love Double Indemnity. I absolutely loved it. That was a blast. Obviously, Casablanca, I was into. But it's one of those things where like my expectations were so high, they were impossibly high. It's
Right, right.
Casablanca, and then it was like I was like, yeah, that's good, and it's like that almost feels like a disappointment, like in a
Hmm.
weird way. Maltese Falcon was the one definitely where I was like, that was another one where I'm like, okay, expectations are through the roof, and I fell asleep, and I feel like that sounds like a criticism, but it's kind of that says more about me at the time that I watched it probably than the movie. I still had a good time with it.
Right.
But I think Sunset Boulevard was my favorite. That
Oh,
was my favorite of the
Sunset
bunch.
Boulevard, forget about it.
Yeah,
That movie, one of the all-time great openings, floating in the pool,
yeah, yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like part of why Lavender Jack has picked up the audience on Webtoon that it has is, in general, the readership is younger on that platform. And so there are a lot of people who've never been exposed to anything noirish before, who've never read Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie or seen. I mean, a small portion of my audience has like seen Double Indemnity. Um, so a lot of them are being exposed to that for the first time. But also, um, like there are people in the audience who like there was a J.C. Leyendecker painting I based a panel off of, and people noticed that.
Mm.
There are some oblique references to the Scarlet Pimpernel Broadway musical in the comic, which is weirdly a big influence on me,
Okay.
and people caught
Yeah.
it. And so when people do catch those things, they feel so like connected to it. Like why
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
is there a Big O reference in this? And I mean, this is the joy of making really specific work that's really personal to you. Is like not everybody's going to get it, but if somebody does, I mean, it's the spider sense you're like me thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it's very rewarding.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Do you get like analytics and like demographic data about the audience from Webtoon? Like how does that piece of it work?
I
Do you
don't
have like
get
a creator dashboard? They send it to you?
I don't get any demographic data. I get some viewership numbers. That's another thing that I think has kept Lavender Jack around for a while, despite its low raw numbers, its low gross numbers, um, because in the general idea of online engagement, like people who actually comment, like, repost, link to, what have you, a piece of online content, like, roughly can be assumed to be 1 in 10. Like, if you
Hmm.
do that, that's a healthy average engagement ratio. With Lavender Jack, it's something like 30%. It's a really high portion of the eyeballs on the comic that will, like, leave a comment, link to it. Um, so, um, like I say, I don't have demographics, although I would be very interested. Um, I know we have a lot of fans in Israel and Palestine. I know we have a lot of fans in France and Brazil. Um, of course, a lot of Americans and a lot of Portuguese fans too. So I don't know quite, and I'm missing out on some. Like, we do have a good portion of Japanese readers as well, which is kind of fun because for a comic with, again, relatively lower viewership, it's nice that there's that spread across the world. Um, I would like to know. Maybe they can tell me now. I've been on the platform for a long time.
Sure, sure. I mean, I was curious just in terms of like if they'd be like, "Hey, your audience is primarily 18 to 24,"
Mhm.
and if that would then impact anything you're doing in terms of like trying to cater to that audience. Sounds like obviously not because you haven't been told that. But or if
Right.
they were like, "Hey, everyone here is 60 to 70," you'd be like, "Okay, like yeah, like let's lean into the PJ Wodehouse and the old Sherlock Holmes."
Well, it definitely was, like, early on. There were things like, mhm, you know, plot elements they asked me to simplify. Um, you know, like, instead of disaggregate, can you say separate? Things like that. Um, Not only because of a younger audience, but an international audience. You don't want to alienate people with things that are too complex.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Um, but in general, I think Webtoon kind of realized that I had become a little bit ungovernable to a degree. Like, I would try to reel back on things, and it would just turn into what it turned into. So I don't think I could change horses at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Um,
it's good. I mean, it is what it is, and it's the fandom. The fandom appreciates it for sure.
right.
Um, with the series concluding, so we've got 11 episodes. It's going to come out. Does it come out on a weekly cadence, or what's
Hmm.
the release schedule? Weekly. Where
And
do you
then
see yourself
on
going next?
Monday, oh, well, I I have a couple of I have a couple things that I'm optimistic about. I don't have something firm yet. Um, One project is that I've worked on a little bit so far, with my with the team. It's a Wow. It's How do you describe an elephant without talking about its ears or trunk? It, it's a chance to create a new character under very specific restrictions that would go to a very different audience than you normally get with Big Two comics. So that's really exciting. And it's an opportunity to work with an old collaborator of mine I've wanted to work with again on something substantial for a long time. The other thing that might happen, and I'm really, this is something I've wanted more than anything in a long time. Like, I really wanted the Spirit, and I really wanted Lavender Jack. This is the first thing in 4 years that I've wanted that much, and it would be kind of similar to Lavender Jack in terms of schedule and content, but it would be very different in terms of format. Like, this would be a format where I could not do my big verbose thing, where I would have to be very punchy and you know brief in my language, and have to be very focused in my action. Like, this will be, if it happens, which I really want it to. Not only would it be a big audience, but it would be like a test of everything I've built up in Lavender Jack, a test of all that less is more stuff that I've had to that I've had to learn, and the like punishing understanding of time budgeting that I have now.
Mm.
How like you can put 4 characters in this scene, but then you have to draw them 18 times. So
Yeah.
could we maybe one of them comes in at the end? Maybe instead it's
Yeah.
maybe they're on a rooftop at night instead of in a library. Things like that.
Mm.
So that I don't know how interesting those answers were with how vague I was, but um, hopefully one of those will work out, and if not, I'll figure out the next thing from there. But I know that whatever it is, I will be going into it with so much stronger a creator, so much broader a toolbox than I had heading into Lavender Jack.
Sure, sure. No, it's got to feel really rewarding. That's super cool. Well,
It
whatever
does.
whatever the specific announcements wind up being, I think it'll be very exciting for fans of the comic. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I definitely I keep up with your every so often on Twitter. You'll share like some like big two fan art type stuff.
Yeah.
So like you can tell that the superhero fandom is alive and well with what
Yes.
you did a thing recently of Daredevil fighting King Thanos, which was super fun.
Right. Yeah, those little like during this period where I couldn't get that immediate feedback from the Lavender Jack audience,
Yeah.
it can be very that going from hearing from a bunch of people every week to not can be very jarring. So doing short comics, whether it's a funny, you know, comic about what if Walter White was Mr. Freeze, or something a little more meaningful, like a comic called Yona Meets John's Brother I did about taking your superhero brother home for Christmas.
Hmm.
It's being able to do those short, sloppy things and have sometimes a quite advanced audience reaction. Um, that kept me going this year when I was too sick to draw the City of Gallery.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. No, and you put out some fun stuff. I definitely recommend people check it out over there on your Twitter. We can link to all that, of course, in the show notes
Awesome.
for the episode. Yeah, definitely. So okay, so you've got some stuff coming. We fingers crossed for you that all goes according to plan. We shall see. Final question for you. What are your favorite reads lately? It can be comics or otherwise, but what have you read lately that you'd recommend?
Boy, my reading has gone completely in the circular file lately. Um, I have been reading a lot of online comics because right now, at the beginning of the year, my horoscope said you will advance in your career by embracing new technologies, and
Okay.
so
Yeah.
I've been embracing like how to do comics on Instagram. How to do 10 panel comics in squares, and so I'm looking at other people who do that, like the amazingly revolting Simon Hanselman doing Meg Mog and Owl.
Crisis
Um,
Zone. Yeah, yeah.
there's a great Instagram comic called Girl Juice that's just
I
really
don't know that one.
funny and idiosyncratic. There's an amazing science fiction horror webcomic called Dead Space. No, that's a that's a video game. Um, this great black and white sci-fi horror comic, bleak, often very environmental stuff.
Yeah.
So just Googling that, it'll pop up. It's crazy popular. So little reads like that have been keeping me going. And then beyond that, it's been TV and movies and the live action stuff that so inspires my work.
Sure, sure. Okay, no, those are good picks. Yeah, I'm. That's another. It's like webtoon, Instagram comics. There's all these. It's funny because it's like it kind of annoys me because it feels unruly. I'm like, listen, I am trying to keep tabs of all of these solicits and traditional print release schedules. Can you all just play by the rules and coordinate yourselves?
Well, that's kind of the fun thing is because it's so disparate, um, and because like when it's something like what I do, like what I do online, where it's just kind of shit posts essentially. Um,
Yeah.
it's like something will get big. Like I did a comic called Twitter Cops that became my most popular thing, and
Hmm.
people would find it, and then they would go to my Twitter page, and they're like, "You do Lavender Jack? You're the guy?
Yeah.
I thought you died." Or like, "Oh man, you're the guy that did the Daredevil D's Nuts comic.
Uh
Amazing."
huh. Yes.
So it's like you do like even though it's spread throughout the internet and it's so hard to get people to just sit still and like can it just be 2005 and you have a website again? um, there's also something to be said for, you know, almost like seeing somebody you met once at a party in 6 months being like, hey, remember me
Remember
from
your name and
Malta? Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah,
Very good.
that's the
Very
hope
good.
anyway.
Okay, cool. Well, Dan, this has been a blast. Definitely, I'm excited about the conclusion here of Lavendar Jack. We'll include links to all the stuff in the show notes as well for folks who want to check it out. And obviously, one of the super cool things about the Webtoon model is you can go and binge the whole thing right now. I had I had an intern. Now they're doing some freelance work for me this past summer, and one of their assignments was to read Lavender Jack and write a review of it, which they did, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. So it was really cool getting to see like somebody who is not super familiar with comics, like go into Webtoon. And I wasn't sure. I was like, I don't know if they're actually gonna like just comics in general. Like at this point, it was like, you know, kind of a more of a just doing some stuff on the website role. But they loved it. So you
That's
won over a new comics fan. So that's a win for sure.
Thanks for hawking the product.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Dan, it's been a blast. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Bye.